Well, good evening to everyone. My name is Dr. Timothy Padgett. I'm the Resident Theologian here at the Colson Center. I'd like to welcome all of our audience. People have been signing up, or if you're just watching it online on YouTube, that's fine too. I'd like to welcome you to our second of our Breakpoint Forums. This has been a series that we've started at the Colson Center to dig a little deeper, to get a little bit more in-depth analysis than what we are able to do in some of our shorter things, like our breakpoints. They're just about 800 words. Our hope with these opportunities is to allow people to hear about important issues of the day, pressing concerns of the day that might be bothering people, that maybe they've heard about in the news, they've seen in their news feeds, they've heard from the pulpit, all sorts of things like that. Our hope is to bring in some experts like we've done tonight, to bring them in to go a little more in depth so we can all take advantage of the great study that they have done. Now, we have the great opportunity tonight to talk about an important issue, and that is the issue of critical theory. As we'll talk about here in just a second, critical theory is something that really was born in the ivory towers of academia. But it doesn't take much paying attention to your social media feeds or whatever else to see, even your sermons and your movies and all sorts of things, to see that it has really crept out. It is an everyday occurrence for a great many people. It has gone from this abstract thing that people once dealt with only, again, in academia, to now people are faced with it pretty regularly. And tonight we have two wonderful guests. I'll be introducing them fully here in a moment. The Drs. Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer. They have written a book recently called Critical Dilemma. I loved it. I read it just a week or so ago. Excellent book. And they're going to be coming to deal with that book and the insights that they gleaned from that book. And to present some of their findings here in a few minutes, but also to answer your questions. The questions that you're going to be able to ask from the audience. We'll put a number up here in just a moment where you can text your questions. And then what will happen is, there it is, 844-872-1088. So you can go ahead and start at any time sending these questions in. In about 30-40 minutes is where we're going to get to the point where we're dealing with those questions. But I'll be moderating those here in just a few minutes. But before we get into the issues of why we're doing this, I want to open in prayer, because this is an issue that requires a great deal of discernment and it requires a great deal of, divine help, because we all need that at all times, particularly with pressing issues like that. So if you'll join me in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for everything that you've given to us. We thank you for the technology to have wonderful opportunities like this, and all of us in different parts of the country to come together and have a conversation, and the wonders of that. We thank you for those blessings. We thank you for the opportunities, the flourishing that we have in our society that has enabled people to be able to study these things, to be able to take the time to really get in depth into these issues, these important issues that really affect a lot of people, affect us in all sorts of ways. And we thank you for our guests tonight, Dr. Sawyer and Shenvi. What a wonderful gift they are to your church, what a wonderful gift they are to your world. And thank you for this book that you've given to us that we can discuss, and not just this book, but all sorts of other issues as well. In the most holy name of the Lord Jesus, for prayer for us tonight. Matter of discussion for us tonight. I want to frame things a little bit here. A lot of us have heard the issue of critical theories. Now, I think if we're honest, it depends on who you are as to what you think that means. I think it's fair to say that for a lot of people out there in the world, when they hear the word, they either use the word critical theory or they hear the word critical theory. And what they mean by that is someone to the left of me that I don't like, or ideas to the left of me that I don't like. For other people who are maybe a little to the left there, their reaction to the ideas of critical theory are at worst, this is an opportunity for us, as in the Exodus, to plunder the Egyptians. There's great wisdom that these scholars, these critical scholars have come up with, and we can use the insights that they came up with in our own search, in our own elaboration of living out the Bible as we should. Or it is a matter of, it's famously people have said we need to, keep the meat but spit out the bones, and that should be our approach to this kind of thing. Others, it has been a much more profound embrace, even in the church, even in those elements of critical theory that have questions about human dignity, the commonality of the human experience of all of us being of one ultimate race, sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, as Lewis would say. Things that challenge that. Some people have embraced that element of critical theory quite wholeheartedly. But still, I think that for most of us, when we hear these issues, we've heard about it a little bit. We've talked about it a little bit. We've seen the hashtags on Twitter or whatever, X, whatever we're supposed to call it now, or Facebook and whatnot. But we've seen it in our Sunday schools as well. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a little bit how this kind of confusing issue, how it kind of plays out in our world in some very real ways. And then I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful guests who can bring us some more specific insight in this. What I want to talk to you about this is just something that's been in the news. Now, actually, I wrote recently about this. So if you're familiar with Breakpoint, you'll know what I'm going to say here. When we, just a few weeks ago, the world woke up in horror to see that Hamas had broken through Israeli fortifications and was going on a wholesale slaughter. We don't need to share the images. I don't even need to go into detail about the images, but they were horrific. Slaughtering of Jews, all sorts of assaults, deaths, dismemberments, all sorts of horrible things that happened. And this was shocking because I think in our world today, we tend to think that we're past that. We're past moments where we have to deal with questions like that, with atrocities like that. We're reminded every once in a while, but we forget that they're real. Now, I think for many of us, we weren't that surprised when some people like Hamas, like Iran, like some of the more radical Muslim groups and nations around the world endorsed what had happened. They have this great hatred towards the Jews, great hatred towards the people of Israel, the state of Israel, and they endorsed what happened. I think that it was a little bit more unsettling to see those voices raised here in the West, here in North America, down in Australia, over in Europe. And while we might have been able to countenance how people who had come from a Muslim background or had a traditional hatred in the Middle East for the state of Israel, why they would be to support these things. But I think that was what was really unsettling for so many of us, was that so many of the voices that were talking about these things, that they were supporting them. These were Westerners. These weren't Muslims. These weren't Arabs. These weren't Turks. These weren't people from that part of the world. These were people these are Westerners raised in a very liberal education, liberal in both senses of the word. And that, I think, was unsettling for a lot of us, wasn't it? It was this time where people we see so many students and activists who are out there protesting in favor of Hamas, either denying the atrocities that had happened or absolutely endorsing them. And that was troublesome, I think, for a lot of us. And it was hard to reconcile. Why is it that these people, particularly these student groups and activist groups, who seem to think that everyone else is a Nazi, could not recognize in their own words and their own actions this rank anti-Semitism? How did we get to the point where that was happening? And this is where critical theory comes in. Critical theory, with its emphasis on interpreting so much of the world through this almost simplistic dynamic in some ways of the oppressors and the oppressed, the powerful and the powerless, the ones who can speak and the voiceless, all that kind of dynamic, that determined people's reactions to it. So you had the strange signs like Queers for Palestine, people who embraced LGBT saying they felt safer in Palestine than they would in the United States. And these are, of course, inane things, and they make no sense in so many ways. But it's because of the influence in so many ways of these critical theory ideas that have taken hold in so many universities and schools and even churches that enables people to look at the people in Israelis who have the technology, who have the money, who have the wealth, who have white skin for some of them. And then you look at the people in Palestine and look at the people in Gaza, and they don't have the wealth, they don't have the power, they don't have the connections and all this kind of thing. So therefore, the first ones, the Jews, the Israelis, they must be the bad guys. And then for the others, the Palestinians, well, they must be the good guys. And whatever the Israelis did, warning didn't matter. Warning the people to get out of the way of the danger, it didn't matter. Whatever the Palestinians did, whatever Hamas did, killing civilians, that wasn't the problem, because they were the good guys. And that is a kind of a macro level thing that we can see in the news. But I think for a lot of us, and I think I'm betting for a lot of the people who are interested in this issue, who've just tuned in to listen to what we're talking about here today, they've seen it in their families, they've seen it in their schools, they've seen it in their churches. Let me tell you one personal story before we move on to our guests. I remember a few years ago, I was having a conversation here in Colorado Springs with some of my friends, some of the men from my church. We'd gotten together to talk. We talked about church, we talked about family, and we talked about issues and ethics. And we got into the issue of sexuality, of gender, of LGBT, and all that kind of thing. For most of us, our focus was on the question, we could basically espouse the standard Christian view of, one man, one woman for life kind of thing. And that even with that, we need to be loving to the people who struggle with that. But then one of my friends piped up And I knew him, and he was a little bit more friendly to these critical theory ideas. And so I wasn't surprised that he said it really. But his response was, well, I think it's really something that all of us, a bunch of white men, Western wealthy men, are sitting around having this discussion. Where are the other voices? Now, setting aside for the moment the irony that it's only in the white, wealthy Western world that there's any real debate about this, about dispute about this among Christians. Setting aside that for a moment, think about what he was saying. The truth and the falsehood, the right and the wrong, were fundamentally determined by the nature of the people making the statements. This was identity politics. This was someone who had imbibed, consciously or unconsciously, had imbibed deeply the issues of critical theory without necessarily realizing that he had done so. And that's why we're having this conversation, because I think there's a lot of people who we're out there, we're having these conversations, we are analyzing issues, we care about the issues, we care about race, we care about inequality, we care about poverty. And yet someone comes and presents us with this idea of critical theory, and in some ways it sounds so good. And as if you listen to the Upstream interview that our guests had with my colleague Shane Morris on this issue, they talked about there is this legacy of the Jim Crow laws. There is this enduring implication of slavery. There have been these things, these macro level influences, these places where the critical theory people get it kind of right. And we hear that and we think, oh, let's go with this a little bit more. And this is what calls for discernment. This is what calls for us to have a moment of discernment. And that takes knowledge, that takes insight, that takes study. And that is why I have my guests here today. I'm going to go ahead and invite them to metaphorically come into the room here with me as we introduce them. We've got Neil Shenvi here and Pat Sawyer. Pat and I were just discussing that he and I both hail from the same part of the country. His southern drawl was very friendly. It's like I take my northern-born boys up to Cracker Barrel every once in a while to have a little bit of the taste of the South. And so you said you're in Greensboro right now, I believe you said?
Just outside of Greensboro, yes, sir.
Just outside of Greensboro. And then Neil, where are you based? I've forgotten.
In Durham, South Durham.
In Durham. Okay, so you're both in the same part of the world there. Very cool. It's some beautiful country over there. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming in here and bringing the insights that you have had, the study that you've had. I found your story, and I'm going to let you tell a little bit of that yourselves, how you got to this point. But listening to your conversation with Shane Morris was so interesting because you both had this background in apologetics in so many ways, and then Neil with you, the chemistry. And I love your analytical mind that you're able to bring on those things. I follow you on Twitter. You have some great insights there, bringing that analytical chemistry mind onto that. And then, Pat, I believe you had the sociological background. Is that correct?
Yes, my Ph.D.'s in educational studies and cultural studies with a concentration in critical philosophy. So,
absolutely.
I
love the fact, and I love to reiterate what my colleague Shane had said, that the fact that you come from slightly different fields, but you're bringing those insights into this particular study, I think is really helpful because there's a lot of us out there. I mean, I've read some critical theory work, and it's hard to track with. It's dense language. I spend a lot of my time editing people's writing, and sometimes I don't know how this got past an editor. You got to wonder, are they doing this on purpose? Or are they doing this for who knows what? So I'm very glad that you're able to bring here. So I believe that, Neil, you're going to take our first question. So I'm going to start off with you. And just as a bit of for those of you who are listening in, they're going to talk for each about 10, 15 minutes. Neil here first, and then Pat. And then we'll take a brief break for about 2.5 minutes for a little video. And then we'll have the Q&A time dealing with these questions that come in at 844-872-1088. And we have already had some coming in. And so, yes, I would love to hear from you, Neil. Kind of the big picture question, I guess, is what we're dealing with here, is dealing with what's a brief overview of critical theory? Because a lot of people, we've heard the term, but we want to know what it is. So starting with that and telling a bit of your own biography, how you got to this story, and just bring us your wisdom here.
Sure. My brief story is that I became a Christian in graduate school at UC Berkeley, and then began writing pretty fast on apologetics. I wanted to share the gospel with my friends and colleagues and coworkers who were atheists, agnostic, intellectuals, scientists. So that culminated in my first book, Why Believe, with Crossway last year. And around the time I finished the first draft, the manuscript, I began seeing a change in our culture. Is around the time of Black Lives Matter really taking off. I was noticing this language around race, class, and gender in the culture and also entering the church. And I was concerned because it didn't seem quite right. Well, around that time, I providentially met Dr. Pat Sawyer and found out that he was doing a Ph.D. in this field. When I asked about his research, I realized that what he was studying was actually being manifested in the culture, these critical theories. So that began me on a course of study where I read tons and tons of primary literature, and we began collaborating, writing about these ideas that were entering the culture and the church. That's why I'm here. So as an overview, what is critical theory? Well, the consensus among scholars is that the critical tradition began with Karl Marx. He could be considered, in the words of Bradley Levinson, the first true critical theorist. And his ideas about economics were not the primary thing going forward that critical theorists focused on. It was rather his ideas about power, how power circulates within societies to produce people with power, without power, to produce oppressors and the oppressed, to produce those with resources and without resources. And so he didn't use the term critical theory. So that term was coined by Max Horkheimer in 1937 in something known as the Frankfurt School. It's a group of sociologists and philosophers working in Germany, the 1920s and 30s. They moved to Columbia in the US later. And they wanted to take Marx's ideas and apply them more broadly than just to economics and class. They wanted to apply his ideas to things like the culture industry and mass media, and still work towards the liberation of the oppressed. But even that was 80 years ago. So today, critical theory is an umbrella category that encompasses many different critical social theories that you hear about. So, for example, critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, post-colonial studies, intersectional feminism. All of these would be considered critical theories because they're all concerned with how power operates within our culture to produce winners and losers, oppressors and the oppressed, the dominant and the marginalized. So that's a brief history of the critical tradition. What Pat and I have done is we wanted to write a book that would explain the ideas at the heart of, one, the critical tradition broadly speaking, and what we see in our culture today. We call it contemporary critical theory. And it's centered around four big ideas: the social binary, hegemonic power, lived experience, and then social justice. Now, I'll explain this idea in a second, but then we see those four big ideas in critical theory expressed in two really important disciplines: critical race theory and queer theory. And those two sort of subfields within critical theory are having the biggest impact both on our culture and on the church. And when you begin to understand these theorists' writings and what they believe, you immediately begin to see how it's impacting our culture in ways that we can't even always recognize immediately. I gave a talk on critical theory like 4 or 5 years ago at NC State. And afterwards, one of the professors came up to me and he said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is everywhere. These ideas are permeating our culture. And people will often say, well, we've hit peak woke. We can't get any crazier. There's no way that we can go farther down the road we're on. And I keep telling people, I'm not a prophet, but I'll tell you this. What you're seeing is not peak woke, because wait until the kids who are currently in high school and college become your pastors, your senators, your doctors, and your judges. That will be something entirely different. So we need to prepare the church right now to address these ideas and to oppose them from a biblical Christian perspective. Okay, so what are the four big ideas of critical theory? Well, the social binary says that society is divided into oppressed groups and oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, nationality, and a host of other identity markers. So when we hear that, people are often confused. They say, well, I know we're not perfect as a society. I mean, there's racism, it exists, sexism exists, but I don't really believe that on a daily basis that people walk around being oppressed. I don't see people burning crosses on my lawn. I mean, I'm a woman. I don't feel like I'm oppressed by the patriarchy. How can you say that? And the second point is this: critical theory has redefined the word oppression. When they say that people are oppressed in society today on a daily basis, they've redefined the word oppression not to merely refer to tyranny or to coercive power or to unjust and cruel treatment. They also include in the definition of oppression the subtle ways in which the ruling class, whether it's whites or men or heterosexuals, impose their values and their norms on culture in a way that all of their values and norms, which justify their own dominance, appear to us to be natural, normal, objective, neutral, even God-ordained. So whenever you have the ruling class, like whites, imposing white values on culture, well, that's white supremacy, and that system oppresses blacks. When you have men imposing their masculine values on culture, that's the patriarchy, and that oppresses all women. When you have heterosexuals applying their heterosexual values to culture, well, that's heterosexism that oppresses gay people. And on it goes. That gender binary, ableism, these are all forms of oppression because they all other and marginalize people that are outside of power. So that's the second idea, hegemonic power. The third idea is lived experience. Lived experience is the way that we can overcome the blindness that we have accrued due to oppression. So the idea is that all of us are socialized into these systems of power, whether it's white supremacy, the patriarchy, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, classism. We're all blinded by these oppressive thought patterns, these oppressive norms and values. We take them for granted. However, if you're part of an oppressed group, whether you're a person of color, a woman, an LGBTQ person, a poor person, if you're oppressed, then through your lived experience of oppression, you can gain greater access to the truth about reality. You can gain what's called a critical consciousness or a liberatory consciousness. Colloquially, you can get woke. You can wake up to the reality of injustice. And then you have the inherent authority to tell other people the reality of society. And conversely, if you're privileged, if you're white or male or straight or cisgender, if you're those things, well, conversely, you are blinded by your privilege. You have both conscious and subconscious reasons to deny the reality of racism, sexism, classism, transphobia, homophobia. And so you have to really defer to the authority of oppressed people who can lead you into the truth. And finally, the final idea within critical tradition is social justice, which critical theorists define as the elimination of all forms of social oppression, which can be based on a person's race, class, gender, sexuality, and so forth. So their end goal is to break down the systems and structures which perpetuate the gender, the social binary, this division between oppressors and oppressed. They want to create a society of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They want to create a society in which all groups share power, and there's no one dominant hegemonic narrative that oppresses people. Okay, so that's critical theory as a whole, or the ideas of contemporary critical theory, but how are they expressed in various disciplines? So you can see is if you take to a first approximation, if you take those four ideas and apply them to race, you get critical race theory. If you apply those four ideas to gender and sexuality, you get queer theory. If you apply those four ideas to education, you get critical pedagogy. So in a sense, all of these various critical social theories are falling under these same four big ideas. But let me dive deeper into critical race theory and queer theory briefly. So again, critical race theory began in the legal field. It was the domain of legal scholars for a few years. It was created by people like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, people like Derek Bell at Harvard, first tenured Black law professor at Harvard, Mara Matsuda. These are all legal scholars. But since the late 80s and early 90s where it originated, it spread throughout academia. So it's now practiced in sociology departments, in political science departments, in healthcare, in philosophy, in theology. So when people say it's just a legal field, that's just wrong. It's now gone way beyond the legal field. So again, four big ideas within critical race theory. And these are found all over the literature from 1989 all the way up until 2023. So one, racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. So again, that sounds odd. People say, well, racism is there. I know that there are racist people out there, but how can you say racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive? Well, again, like critical theory redefines the word oppression, critical race theorists have redefined the word racism to refer not to overt acts of racial discrimination and hatred, but to also refer to the subtle ways in which whites impose their values on people of color in a way that disadvantages them. So that any system that perpetuates this hierarchy, its racial hierarchy, that is racism, even if there's no ill intention or enmity. And the second idea then is racism isn't perpetuated merely by personal actions, but is hidden beside ideas like colorblindness, meritocracy, objectivity, and neutrality. So even supposedly neutral and fair and objective laws are really masks to conceal the way that they perpetuate the racial status quo. So these ideas are actually not remedies to racism. Colorblindness is not a remedy to racism. Critical race theory would say that colorblindness is often a way to conceal racism or even perpetuate racism. Third, the idea is that racism is best recognized through lived experience. And harkening back to the critical tradition, CRT would say that to be a person of color is to have a heightened awareness of racial reality. And conversely, To be white is to be, in some sense, blinded to the reality of racism. Then finally, this is a key point. Critical race theory states very plainly that racism is one of many interlocking systems of oppression. So critical race theorists from the very earliest start of the movement will say that a defining element of CRT is that racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, homophobia, these are all interlocking systems of oppression that must be dismantled simultaneously. So critical race theory is not only about race. It brings in an entire liberatory framework. They will say it's part of a larger movement to free all oppressed people, that we need, quote, massive social transformation on all these fronts to achieve justice. So Timothy talked about how he saw that sign Queers for Palestine. Well, I'm not sure if they're reading Kimberly Crenshaw or Judith Butler or who, doesn't really matter. That intersectional framework is in the water today. And they're basically, without knowing it, recapitulating these ideas that were put forward by people like Kimberly Crenshaw 30 years ago. So if you hear someone say, well, critical race theory is just a legal study field, it's only taught in graduate schools, it's only about race, those are all just absolutely false. One thing I want to emphasize here is our book contains 770 plus footnotes. We cite over 200 primary sources related to critical social theory. We have entire block quotes of people in their own words, critical race theorists, queer theorists, stating what they believe. And so we wanted to have a resource for the church so you could just say, this is what they are saying. I'm not listening to a secondary or tertiary source. I'm not listening to Neil and Pat pontificate on what theorists believe. I am reading their very words. And from the earliest days of critical race theory, the co-founders said things like, we need massive social transformation to get rid of racism, sexism, and heterosexism all at once, at the same time. Okay, so that's critical race theory. In the last discipline, the last 3 minutes, queer theory. Queer theory is critical theory applied to gender and sexuality. So again, 4 big ideas. One big idea is that they have to divorce, very starkly, sex versus gender. So sex they would define as our biological characteristics like XY chromosomes, XX chromosomes, secondary features like facial hair, hip size, things like that. That's biological sex. But gender, queer theorists would say, is untethered from sex. Gender is a social category that human beings have constructed, and it's not connected to sex. It's independent of sex. This is the first idea. Second idea is that gender is a complex category, meaning there's not just one gender spectrum. Actually, there are multiple gender spectra that include things like gender expression, how you express your gender identity, how you think of yourself and what category you think of yourself, whether it's male or female or non-binary or gender fluid. There are gender norms, things that we expect men or women to do in society. There are all these different, and there's biology, of course, a different spectrum. You can be masculine biology, feminine biology, or intersex biology. So there are now multiple gender spectra, and anyone can fall anywhere on any of those spectra. The second idea. Third idea is that gender is one of many interlocking systems of oppression. Again, what's amazing today is that under the influence of this cross-pollinating effect, today you can't really separate out critical race theory and critical pedagogy and queer theory and feminism. They're all interrelated because if you read a critical race theory textbook, they'll have an entire chapter on gender. If you read a feminist textbook, you'll find an entire chapter on race and physical ability and disability. And so all of these disciplines are in their own words, overtly interconnected. You cannot do one alone or in isolation. And finally, a queer theory is aimed at the deconstruction of all norms, not just sort of commonsensical norms about male and female, but really all ideas that they view as human constructs. This is where we get to the most disturbing element of queer theory, which is its acceptance of pedophilia and its normalization of pedophilia. And I want to say that not all LGBTQ people think pedophilia is okay. Many gay people think it's horrifying and ought to be criminalized. But queer theorists, there's a large strand of queer theory that has always been about dismantling the adult-child binary, just like they dismantle the male-female binary. So you will find queer theorists overtly affirming that what they call intergenerational sex is, or what we'd call pedophilia, is a matter of debate amongst queer theorists themselves. Some see it as bad, others see it as another norm that must be deconstructed. And actually today we're seeing Christians, professing Christians who are very progressive, obviously, but they're overtly applying queer theory to theology to get something they call queer theology, where they're undermining norms like the doctrine of sin, doctrines of good and evil, male and female, obviously, but they're really trying to queer all of these traditional Christian notions across the board. And so that's a brief overview of this field. There's a lot more in the book. I want to emphasize again, we wrote this book to be a resource for people, to wake the church up, to see how dangerous these ideas are, and to really expose you to the literature almost firsthand. You're going to read thousands of words of direct quotes from these theorists. We do explain them in case they get a little bit abstract, and we have diagrams and figures. We really want you to see that this is not just us being alarmist or scaremongering. These ideas are really out there in the culture, and they are becoming more and more and more apparent. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I mean, what a massive thing you managed to get us through in 15 minutes. So thank you so much for doing that. I love, one of the things I loved about your book is the thing you just mentioned there, all the footnotes and whatnot, and all the quotations, because I think that so often when these conversations happen, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, the defense from critical theorists is that if people criticize them, well, you haven't read the literature. Oh, you're just being mean-spirited. One, read through that. Well, your book and also the book Cynical Theories, another book that covers some of these same issues. Each of these books is so great because, again, it's footnoted, quoted, enough that you're not taking the people out of context. And I love the fact you had such a gracious tone in the way you were speaking of these things, because it can be so easy with hot button issues to just start throwing bombs across the barricade. And that doesn't help really much of anyone except for your own ego. So I really appreciated that. One question I want to have for you before we move on to Pat, related to something you mentioned. Actually, I'm borrowing from a friend of mine who asked me about the use of the word woke. Now, you've used the word woke, and you have been very gracious in your terms and the way you've spoken to these people. I know this might be a bit of a gotcha question. How would you use that? Because you point out places where people misuse all sorts of things. How is that a constructed, or I use it too. So this isn't, I'm not trying to trap you here. How do you use it in such a way? How would you define it in a constructive way? Because I mean, as you said, sometimes it's people use it themselves, and sometimes it's an insult. So take that away. What do you think of that?
Yeah, we tend to use it sparingly. So in the book, we have a whole section near the beginning called What's in a Name? We actually ask, what's the proper name for these ideas? Are they critical theory? Is it cultural Marxism? Is it intersectionality? Is it wokeness? And we talk about how people will claim that the word woke has been co-opted. It's a pejorative term. It's almost a racial slur because it's domiciled to the Black community. It's been around for decades, which is true. And we point out, well, actually, if you look at the literature, there are critical theorists, progressive feminist scholars who own the word woke and equate it with critical theory. We cite a paper in a pedagogy journal where they say, we are woke. It's the title of the paper. They define it basically to mean exactly what I said, for those 4 ideas. So we're not saying it's the only term you can use, but we're saying that we didn't just steal this. These are critical theorists themselves defining themselves as woke, telling you what it means. So if you have a problem with that, take it up with them, not with us. But that said, we tend to use the term contemporary critical theory because that's a very neutral, descriptive term. Right. It's not pejorative. We basically coined it ourselves. So you can't accuse us of slandering anyone.
Well, thank you so much for that. Well, if I want to bring Pat in, your sidekick here, your partner in crime, to discuss with us a little bit. And the question that I want to kind of put to you for your statement is, as we've said, this is something that was in academia, but we see it in the church too. And so my question then to you is, how did that happen? How did that transfer from very secular, often anti-theistic, explicitly anti-Christian ideas? How has it become so popular within the church? So please, Dr. Pat Sawyer, please share with us.
Okay, first, great to be with you. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, I grew up in a dead Methodist church. We went to church most Sundays, but I didn't hear the gospel in church. The gospel wasn't really part of my family in terms of how my family was handled. My dad prayed at the dinner table, but that was about it. We never cracked a Bible or opened a Bible. Well, when I was 18, I had a friend of mine come by that tell me that he was going to commit suicide on the weekend. And that got me thinking about, my care and love and concern for him. And it got me thinking about what I might could do to help him. We talked for 3 or 4 hours, but I wasn't sure that I had, talked him off the cliff, so to speak. He begged me not to tell my parents or tell anyone. Of course, I told him that I wouldn't. But then as soon as he left, I told my parents. Obviously, I told my mom about what he was thinking about doing. And then I went and I found my Bible that I had buried in the bottom of my closet. I got it when I was 12 years old in confirmation class. And I started reading, trying to find something for him, some kind of solution, some kind of answer for him. And then I was just captivated by what I read. I read most of the New Testament that night. And as is commonly as a common feature of reading the Bible, you start to figure out that it is reading you. And so I got saved that night. And thankfully, in terms of my friend, my mom caught up with his parents, and they didn't go out of town on the weekend. They spent time with him, and he did not do that terrible act. But that's when I became a real believer. I quickly went to UNC Chapel Hill undergrad, got involved in some Christian ministries, started to get involved, loved to read, and started to read a lot, read the Bible and read commentaries and grow in my faith. And that led to a desire to get involved in apologetics. And so I did that. At first, I began by doing some open air preaching in the quad area and the pit area of UNC Chapel Hill, if you're familiar with that. And then that led to getting into apologetics relative to discussions with Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, those kinds of groups. And I became a banker. I was a banker for close to 20 years in the financial services and banking industry. Before I did that, I considered going into the ministry. I actually went to seminary, had a scholarship, but then the scholarship ran out. The person that was going to fund my scholarship passed away, and then their children decided they didn't want to clear the check. And so I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to be doing with my life. I thought maybe I had a calling to the ministry, but wasn't sure. But I didn't feel comfortable taking out a lot of money and be unsure. And so this was back when I was around 23. And so since when I left seminary and trying to figure out what I would do with my life, I landed in the banking and financial services industry. And so for about 20 years, I was involved in the banking sector. My last role, I was a regional vice president and regional director at a mid-regional bank. And along the way, as I began to do lay apologetics, get married, have children, I felt God pressing me to get more and more into the arena of ideas. And so I considered again going back to the ministry, and then I considered going to secular graduate school and getting degrees in higher education in a secular institution to be salt and light in those institutions. And ultimately, God led me to do that. So in my 40s, I'm an old man. In my 40s, I went and got a master's and a master's concentration, a Ph.D. and a Ph.D. concentration, and began to teach in a secular institution. My Ph.D. is in educational studies and cultural studies, and that Ph.D. is in the critical tradition. And I chose that Ph.D. for two reasons. One, I wanted to choose something that would have a direct challenge to the Christian faith, to Christian epistemology, that would be representative of a large stakeholder in society like the education field. And so my hope was that God would protect my mind, and that I would learn, and that I would come to good understanding of the knowledge area and be salt and light in that knowledge area. And then secondly, I chose that area of study because of the overlap of justice concerns that I had as a Christian. And the critical tradition, as you know, is concerned about justice issues. And so, for instance, critical race theory, as Neil has mentioned, is about many things, but it's also pushing back against racism, obviously. And of course, real Christians are against racism. So there was some overlap. And so that's why that's why I chose the field of education and cultural studies. Now, my PhD is in the critical tradition, again, as my field is, and my PhD, the conceptual framework starts with critical theory, then it goes to critical pedagogy, and then cultural foundations. And my PhD is about social justice in higher education in the age of neoliberalism. Okay, and so that's how I got into this area of study. In terms of issues with the church, One of the reasons why Neil and I met each other is partly because we had a mutual friend that was in each of our Bible study. The friend was in a Bible study of mine, and the friend was in a Bible study of Neil's. And they said, hey, you guys need to meet and get together and discuss apologetics. When we did that, that quickly moved into a discussion around critical social theory. And the reason why I got concerned in terms of what was happening in the church is because I began to see various persons of color really lean into their ethnic identity as their top identity. Now, as Christians, they theoretically were saying certainly that their identity in Christ was their primary identity, but functionally, their blackness, their ethnic identity really was rising to the top of their preeminent identity marker. And then in addition to that, some of my secular scholarship is pushing back against white nationalism, white power groups, challenging those groups. I do that in my scholarship, and then I also do that speaking. And obviously those groups have made their ethnic identity their highest identity as they're pushing for a white ethno-state. And then some of those groups claim Christian ties when they attempt to do that, which is egregious and terrible. But they claim that Christian discourse claim to be Christians. And so I begin to see ethnic identity really rising to the top of how people were manifesting their primary identity, even though they were making claims to the Christian faith. And this concerned me. And then I begin to see larger evangelical ministries start to shift their emphasis from spiritual concerns to temporal alleviation, to social justice and temporal concerns. And I begin to see certain national Christians do this as well. So this concerned me. Now, when we ask the question, why is it that critical social theory has made some inroads into the church? That's a very good question. There's really a shotgun answer to that. Now, I'm going to have to be a little bit pessimistic and negative here to answer that question. I was actually voted most optimistic in high school. So I'm actually a positive guy and am a strong person of hope. But I'm going to have to be a little bit negative here. And I'm not trying to be too critical in this, no pun intended. But part of the reason why the critical social theory has made inroads into the church is because the state of our churches are not in a good place when it comes to biblical literacy. We just don't know our Bibles well enough. Particularly now, certainly certain churches are very good at centering the Bible and centering sound doctrine, but the typical church, even in evangelicalism, is not pushing hard in terms of teaching sound doctrine or teaching systematic theology or teaching good and robust theological instruction for the typical member. And the fact is that to spot error and to spot heresy, one doesn't necessarily have to learn all about the error and the heresy to spot error and heresy. They just need to learn the truth and know the truth deeply within them. And so I think the lack of instruction around sound doctrine and theology and getting the typical member in the pews, getting them to a place where they are a lay student of theology, I think we've got deficits there in the church. And that is partly why critical social theory has made some inroads. Along with that is a concern of cultural apologetics. That's another thing that is lacking in our churches. A strong effort to teach the person in the pew about cultural apologetics. That is applying the Bible, applying Christian epistemology to the issues of the day, to the zeitgeist of the day, of the issues that are plaguing our culture and society, bringing the Bible to bear upon those issues. That is not something that is being done in a lot of our churches. And because of that, critical social theory is making some inroads. And that would also be connected to issues of worldview. Now, for the Christian, the Bible should be driving our worldview. The Bible should condition and shape our worldviews. The whole counsel of God should shape our worldviews. Now, obviously, the Bible, from an Orthodox position standpoint, the Bible's inerrant, it's infallible, and it's true and right to everything that it speaks to. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us much about changing out our carburetor in our car, but the Bible does have macro principles and precepts that speak to all of life. Our ontological lives. Ontology is the nature of being human in the world. And for the Christian, the Bible is the preeminent shaper of our worldview, our lens in terms of how we see and interpret the world. And I would submit to you that the larger evangelical church has moved away in many respects from really centering the Bible in terms of really thinking about all of life and dictating all of life. And so this is another reason why critical social theory has made an impact. Now, moving in a more positive direction per se, one of the reasons, a primary reason that critical social theory has made inroads into the church is because Christians share some of the same concerns that critical theorists share. And again, I'll be talking about critical theorists, kind of different from where I'm coming from, but do keep in mind that I'm in the critical tradition. My scholarship is in the critical tradition from a secular standpoint. But the realities are that critical theory and critical theories often care about issues that Christians care about. Christians care about sexism and how evil sexism is. Christians care about racism, how evil racism is. Well, so does critical social theories. Feminist theory cares about sexism and wants to push back on it. Critical race theory is concerned about issues around racism, and so are Christians. Critical pedagogy, is one of its primary concerns, is capitalism and neoliberalism, the idea that money is a driver of everything. Now, I happen to be a capitalist and a conscientious one, but the notion of neoliberalism, that the idea that money is the final barometer and arbiter of everything, well, that is certainly problematic for a Christian. And critical pedagogy pushes back against that and really challenges neoliberalism. And so Christians see critical social theory doing things that are that they are very interested in, that we are very interested in. And another aspect of this is social justice. Now, the way critical social theory defines social justice is certainly not identical to the way that Christians define biblical justice, but there certainly is some overlap. And critical social theory is concerned about the under-resourced, those that are struggling and not thriving and not flourishing in society. And Christians are concerned about the under-resourced as well. And so part of the reason why critical social theory has made some impact in the church is because we've gotten it honest, because we care about some of these issues as well, particularly at a macro level, at a bird's eye level. There's a lot of similarities. So that's another reason why critical social theory has made some inroads. Another concern, another dynamic would be is that our society, our culture, has really slipped in over the last several years into victimhood culture. Cultures across time and space, and cultures in our culture in the U.S., it shifts in terms of what it emphasizes over time. At times, honor culture is prominent in certain societies, or dignity culture is prominent in certain societies. Well, of late, over the last 10 years, victimhood culture has been very prominent in our society. And critical social theory is all about the oppressor and oppressed binary. It's all about victimhood. It's all about identity politics. And it's gotten to a place where victimology and victimhood culture is so pronounced in our society that to be a victim yields some cultural capital and cultural cachet to some extent. If you're triggered, if you're easily traumatized, if you're dealing with trauma, you're easily triggered, well, those around you will kind of part the sea for you. Everything will stop, and you will be attended to, you will be addressed. And that trauma and that triggering is tied to identity, the range of intersectional identities that are part and parcel of critical social theory. And so when it's triggered in their gender, or they're triggered in their race, or they're triggered in their ethnicity, or they're triggered in their sexuality. And when someone begins to raise those kinds of concerns, then they're now, the way our culture is set up, people are stopping and pausing and giving those people opportunity to deal with what they're dealing with in such a way that the people around them are having to acquiesce. And if you are someone who is easily triggered, connected to these intersectional categories, now you've been given cultural power to speak to any of those issues of where there is offense connected to those intersectional categories. So there's cultural cachet in that victimhood perspective. And that's partly the church has struggled with to know how to deal with that, because the church certainly wants to, when someone is going through actual trauma and has been genuinely triggered, we certainly want to care about that. Obviously, we want to come alongside of people and weep with those who weep and be a friend. But critical social theory has put this notion on steroids. Now, with the advent of microaggressions being prominent, any slight little offense now is considered huge and big, and the world has to stop. And so that's another reason why critical social theory is making an impact in the church, because the church has struggled with how to deal with the reality and the strength of victimhood in the larger culture. And then the final thing that I would mention is that, as Neil mentioned, critical race theory is a prominent critical social theory. And critical race theory, among other things, really cares about racial pain and racial concerns. And if we think just for a minute, a lot of our society, in terms of the birth of our society and the length and the history of the United States, slaves began arriving to this part of the world in the 1520s. But when we think about slavery, often historically, people look to 1619. And so even starting there, we've got 250 years of slavery, and then we got 100 years of black code laws and Jim Crow. And so people of color, particularly blacks, have been massively historically oppressed for a good period of time, a good percentage of time of this country, our informal and formal beginnings. And so that is huge, egregious, wicked, terrible. And the church has often been complicit in not standing against the evil of slavery and Jim Crow as it should. And so Christians today know this. And so there's a sense in which we're looking for solutions to fight against racism because the church has failed at points. Now, obviously not every church, and many abolitionists were white, and there were churches standing against slavery and Jim Crow. Okay, so we don't want to think incorrectly about it, but we have to embrace the fact that real Christians have been complicit in racism in terms of slavery and Jim Crow. And since we know that historically, many of us are looking for ways to not be that way, to push back against that and to counter that. And so critical race theory has offered a solution for the racial ills that plague our society. And it is concerned about pointing to what has happened historically and how there's still effects happening today. And so the Christian can think, well, I certainly want to be against racism, and I can't stand the fact that the church has not been quite as strong and as strong as it is needed to be. I'm going to be different. So here is a pathway to really signal that I am against racism. And here is a pathway, critical race theory, for me to take some action to push back against racism. And so that's another reason. And then tied to that, and I'll wrap up with this, critical race theory speaks to the pain that people of color have, particularly blacks, when it comes to racial pain. It gives voice to that pain. And critical race theory, one of its primary tenets is to elevate black voice, elevate black experience. And so critical race theory is saying to the black community, in a real sense, I feel the pain that you have. And that's what critical race theory is about, listening to the voices and moving forward the voices of the black community. And a part of that lament and that voice is around racial pain. And the fact that critical race theory has taken the time to listen to racial pain of the black community, that makes it very attractive to people of color. I've got a good friend, Deuce Branch. He is a professor at Southeastern. If you know anything about Christian hip hop, he is the ambassador in Christian hip hop. And so he's an old head when it comes to Christian hip hop. He's one of the founding really members of Christian hip hop, and he's a dear friend of mine. And he's endorsed our book, Critical Dilemma. So he's got his head right around critical race theory. He knows that it's flawed. But we've had a number of discussions where he has said to me, with, even almost in tears, in a very serious, manner, that critical race theory offers a salve to racial pain, and therefore it's very attractive to us. And it can blur our discernment on some level because it cares so much about racial pain. And this is a reminder that us as Christians, and if you're part of the Black community as a Christian, then you really are helpful in unpacking and giving insight to how that racial pain is manifested and works itself out in a myriad of ways. And then for those of us who have not experienced a lot of racism, we need to be sensitive to the dynamic of critical race theory speaking to racial pain. And then as a church, as a collective church, we need to be extra sensitive when it comes to racism and racial pain, and listen to our brothers and sisters of color if we happen to be white, and coming alongside those who are weeping and weeping with those who weep. And the church can be in the vanguard of all these solutions, all the ills that critical race theory and critical social theory in general points to, but the church needs to step up and step into that. And we have a great opportunity to do that and to lead in these ways. And it's our hope that our book, Critical Dilemma, will give some insight in how to do that. Thank you.
Well, again, this is two little sections in a row where we've just gotten a wonderful amount of information to discuss these important issues. I got to say, I sympathize with your Southern culture upbringing there. You're talking about, well, it's just part of the water, right? I remember one of my pastors growing up, he said when he was in high school, he was witness to, and he said, well, yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm from Virginia. And that's for anyone who's grown up in the South or all sorts of other cultures, you recognize that thing. And I mean, that's funny and that there's a connection there. I wonder how much of that has fed into the problem that you've been discussing here, that Christianity became merely a cultural artifact, just something that you did. You go to church. Well, you're from Tennessee like me. Of course you go to church. You get married in a church. And I think there's in the South, it's it's evangelical Baptistic kind of thing. In other parts of the North and other places in the Midwest, it's a Roman Catholic thing. But there is that element that is purely this cultural thing that you go through. And I wonder, we can get it. I want to get to the questions from our audience here in just a second. But I think that I wonder how much of the problem came because this, what Schaeffer called the Christian consensus, died because we weren't feeding it anymore. It was just something we went along with, this inertia sort of thing. So,
Tim, I think that's a really good point, because that ties into the reality in terms of true biblical Christianity. When we understand Christian epistemology, we recognize that cultural positions are downstream from theological positions, and political positions are downstream from cultural positions. So if we've got solid and right theological positions, those realities should have impact on our cultural and political positions. But if we just have a cultural Christianity that is checking certain boxes in terms of political perspective, then it's easy to get away from theological realities and slip into kind of this hollow and fake and cultural Christianity that has no power. And that was my case. When I read the Bible for the first time, I was like, wow, I've been a quote unquote Christian, but I haven't trafficked in any of this. And it worried me. And I thought I was a pretty good kid on my way to heaven. I was a good guy. I didn't drink. I didn't smoke. I scored touchdowns on Friday night. I mean, what else is there to do?
That's what matters.
And I went to church every Sunday, and I was the president of the youth group. We planned a ski trip, and we played ping pong, and we had a couple of films on don't do drugs. That's what we did. But then when I started to read the Bible for the really first time, and God saved me, got a hold of me, now we recognize that the Christian faith speaks to all kinds of issues and will instruct the true Christian in ways that the cultural Christian is completely absent from. So,
well, excellent. Thank you again so much. Well, we're going to take a very brief break here, and just for just a moment, about 2.5 minutes. This is a little video just going to talk about our upcoming conference. It's in May. It's going to be down in, I believe it's Arlington, Texas. So please feel free to check out this little video. And I believe our two guests will be there in May. So it's the Colson Center National Conference. So here's our little video about that.
Hey, John Stone Street here from the Colson Center. We have big changes ahead for next year, the 2024 Colson Center National Conference. This is our annual gathering. It's a family reunion for Colson Fellows. It's a way for all of our Breakpoint listeners and people who care deeply about living out a Christian worldview can gather together. But we're in a strange and consequential cultural moment right now. And all of our attention this year is being put towards what does it mean to live a life of courage. Courage is something that we think of for other Christians in other times in difficult situations, and maybe haven't thought deeply enough about what it's going to take for us to live out a faithful Christian life today. I'm absolutely convinced with the cultural pressures increasing around us, we're going to have to think deeply about what it means to have courage. That means we're going to have to define courage. We're going to have to define what it means to cultivate courage. After all, you just can't decide one day to put on courage and think everything's going to be okay. The significance of a courageous Christian life is what's led us to rethink and replan how we do the Colson Center National Conference. Now, a lot is going to look the same. We're going to have world-class speakers addressing this topic from a dizzying variety of angles. But we're also going to make some changes, like increasing the time through breakout sessions to look at what does courage look like in different areas of our life. We also know that we can only be courageous together. So we're going to lock in on more time to spend together and networking and meeting each other. And even that means adding an additional 12 hours or so to the overall conference. The Worldview Intensive is going to be back, but we're going to look specifically this year, heading into an election year, about what courageous citizenship looks like. Not just like we're citizens of a particular nation, but we're actually citizens of both the city of man, but most importantly, the city of God. This is an incredibly important gathering, and I hope you'll join us. We're going to be at a brand new facility, the beautiful Lowe's Hotel and Conference Center in Arlington, Texas. And the dates are May 30th to June the 2nd. Register now to join us at colsonconference.org.
Well, welcome back to our little show here. We thank you so much for continuing this with us here. We have a whole slew of questions. We will not be able to get to them all. I love all the questions that we had. Maybe I can write up something other that kind of summarizes some of them. Hope to get to some of these here. A lot of this issue, as I mentioned before, when you talk about critical theory, it can be really arcane vocabulary. Sometimes I think it's intentionally arcane vocabulary for a variety of reasons. I mean, is it so that you can, it's like the emperor's new clothes. Well, I get it because I follow the language. Or is it to be kind of a defense mechanism? So it just makes it hard to get into. But I think for a lot of our audience, they're not necessarily going to read the books that are behind me on my shelf, behind on Neil's shelf there. They're not necessarily having the time to get to those, but they do encounter some of these things like, lived experience. That's actually one of the questions that came through here. I want to start with a more personal one. A lot of the time they'll come and say, well, your theories, your ideas as a Christian, as a non-critical theorist, that's all well and good. You've got your facts and figures, but what about the lived experience? Now that'd be something that like I might come and say, I don't think you're correct because it reasons A, B, and C. And they will say, that's not valid. That does not trump my lived experience or my friend's lived experience. Can you speak to how we can engage with that? Because it's such a slippery thing. How do you challenge something that is in so many ways so nebulous and subjective and you can't access it? How do you challenge the lived experience argument of some of these things?
We talk about in our book, because Christians will hear, lived experience and they'll think, well, James says we should be slow to speak, quick to listen. So isn't that just about listening to the lived experience? Am I being wrong if I say, well, no, the lived experience is faulty? And the answer is we can definitely listen and be slow to speak. But in the end of the day, Christians are called to make scripture and not anyone's experience, not yours, not mine, the ultimate arbiter of truth. It's not. We can be mistaken. And how you approach it apologetically, I would just do something like this, point out that, as Pat will tell you, he's interacted with white nationalist groups and asked them, well, why do you think blacks are inferior to you? And they'll give you their lived experience. Well, I've been treated badly by a black person. That's my lived experience. And what are they doing? They're taking their lived experience and they're treating it as inviolable and unchallengeable, and then extrapolating from their personal experience to a general truth about reality. Well, you say, well, they shouldn't do that. I agree. But then if they shouldn't do that, neither should I, neither should you. No one can say, go from their personal experience and extrapolate to general truths. And more than that, also, like, people say lived experiences will conflict. I mean, some person says things like, or one person will say, well, I know that my sexuality is fluid, or I'm polyamorous. I need to have multiple sexual partners. That's my lived experience, living as a polyamorous man. And we have to say, but the Bible says that's wrong. It doesn't matter what our experiences are. My lived experience is I want to eat ice cream all day, but I know it's bad for me. So we have to always hold up our lived experiences to the standards of objective truth about reality and about Scripture. And I want to add one more thing too. I see there are a ton of questions here. We'll try to be concise and answer them as many as we can. But a number of them are explicitly treated in entire sections in our book. I saw a question about James Cone. We have a section on James Cone in our book. And so many of these questions, they're great questions, but we did actually anticipate many of them. And that's why we wrote the book, so that you have a resource. You don't have to come to a Zoom call, but you can read the book. It's all there in black and white.
And again, before Pat, you get on here, just remember, if you do have a question in the audience and you want to send something in, you have a question for our panelists here, it's 844-872-1088. So just send that in, and we'll hopefully, we won't be able to get them all, but hopefully get to as many as we can. So Pat, did you have any thought on that, about the lived experience aspect there?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that you can't take a small sample set of experiences and make that something that leads you to automatically extrapolate to universal perspective. So you've got to incorporate larger data sets of information to start making claims about society in any way that will be relevant and valid ultimately. Now, with that said, we do recognize that someone's lived experience can aid in their understanding of a number of things. All right. So no doubt, we don't deny that lived experience can teach you something and tell us something. Okay. So please understand that. I would also mention that lived experience is tied to this notion of standpoint epistemology, that if you are of a certain identity, certain ethnic identity, or certain social location, then that automatically gives you a certain level of insight relative to how you should interpret and think about your lived experience. And the problem with that is that's just made up. It's just what critical social theorists say. It doesn't necessarily make it true just because that is said. Standpoint epistemology will say that a person of color has special insight into the social analysis about race, and then extrapolate that further into social analysis, period. And that if you are white, then your standpoint of being white actually hides and diminishes your ability to see clearly in terms of social analysis. Well, again, that is just made up. That is not necessarily the case. And then in addition to that, we need to keep in mind that it is not the quality of the identity of the person making the idea that is most important. It is the quality of the idea itself. Okay? And so all ideas need to be put on the table, no matter where they are coming from. And can you imagine if you've got a white male pastor that's leading a church? Well, he is certainly equipped by the grace of God, if he's a duly appointed elder, by the means that are part of the church, then he is capable of speaking into the issues that are providentially brought about in his church, and shouldn't be thought of as otherwise. Now, clearly, if someone in his church happens to have a unique experience relative to racism, well, then that person will be sought out for their insight and their assistance in maybe leading something. Their voice will be prioritized in certain ways, of course, because that's reasonable. But we can't make lived experience this impenetrable perspective that can never be assailed or questioned, because then that will run into some horrible, horrible epistemology in terms of how we are interpreting what we know to be true and conclusions that we are making. And we can also flip the script. If the oppressed says, well, I'm oppressed, and that's my experience, so therefore I have special insight into what it means to be oppressed, then the oppressor can say, well, I'm an oppressor, And so I have special insight into what it means to be an oppressor, to have flourishing and have a thriving life and have agency and upward mobility. I know all about that because I'm doing that. You don't know anything about that because you're not doing that. So now you need to listen to me, everything that I would have to say about that topic. So we can see how that would just be kind of this warring perspective of lived experience. And that ultimately is not the way to adjudicate ideas.
That's great. So much of what we do at the Colson Center about worldviews is helping people understand how their cultural has affected their understanding. So in that sense, there's a parallel, there's an analog. They're saying something that's right. I think the difference between a constructive view of this sort of thing and a destructive view is understanding that our context, our environment, our upbringing, or et cetera, they shape your understanding of the world. They don't determine it. They don't determine the truth or falsity of what you've said. You need to take account of the fact that I've grown up in thus and such a culture and with this and such a situation. That's definitely something that we need to pay attention to. And I think that what you have is that when each of you talked about like the popularity of these issues, that they're critical theories, they provide a structure. And that gets into one of the questions. Actually, someone asked if we could get to some of the bullet point questions that we provided ahead of time about whether it is a worldview. And I think that what you see, I'm going to put my 2 cents here for a second to turn of view. There's what critical theory does is in a world in which we no longer believe in truth, it provides us with an intellectual and moral structure, sense of justice, sense of peace. It provides that. So my argument would be that, yes, it is a worldview. But I know that sometimes when we at the Colson Center have written about critical theory, people have said they push back. They said the critical race theory, critical theory, these are not worldviews. So I would like to hear y'all's take on that because you've done a lot more research on than I have. So would you say that critical theory is a worldview?
Well, let me start out and then Neil, you can pick it up. We would say that critical social theory doesn't have to act as a worldview. People can employ certain aspects of critical social theory. We're not superstitious. One doesn't have to onboard it in a robust way. But with that said, critical social theory, when it is operating as it wants to operate, it absolutely is operating as a worldview. It is pushing for the colonization of the mind. It wants more and more jurisdiction over how you think. See, critical social theory answers big questions. It answers questions around epistemology, how we know what we know to be true. It answers questions around ontology. What does it mean to be, to move, and to act in the world, to be a human being in the world? It answers questions around phenomenology, day-to-day lived experience, day-to-day existence. Well, if you're answering those kinds of questions, now you're getting into meta-narrative and worldview. And so absolutely, critical social theory functions often for a lot of people as a worldview. I have colleagues, they live out their life from a critical social theory grid. That's in their moral makeup in terms of how they're justifying their moral lives and existence and justifying themselves is done through social justice, through critical social theory praxis. So yes, it does operate as a worldview. And Neil, you may want to say more about that.
One of the things we do in the book that I think is helpful is we quote from people who themselves were deeply into the social justice movement. People like Carrie Smith. She was once a self-described social justice warrior who then became a Christian. And she calls it a worldview, a religion, a cult. Another guy we quote from was an anarchist, and he said he lived and breathed safe spaces and intersectionality and oppression theory. And he says the same thing. He himself in an essay in Quillette talks about it was the gospel to him. It was like he was converting the pagans, not through Bible tracts, but through magazines and posters and social justice activism. So when they themselves say it was my religion, they should take them seriously. And this is actually related. Several people asked, well, how do we get people out of the cult? Because it really is, it's like a different religion. It's like, how do you convert people or pull them back from the brink? And are there any success stories? I think, yes, there are. And they're mentioned in the book. We talked about people who did. And I think a lot of it for Christians is exposing them to the primary sources, explaining to them where these ideas come from and how they conflict with the Bible clearly. And it helps to have a deep knowledge yourself. Often Christians go with guns blazing, but they haven't really done a lot of reading. And so quickly it's shown that they have a pretty shallow grasp of these ideas. I'm not trying to shame you here, I'm just trying to equip you. It's like if you want to be a missionary to a Muslim and you don't know anything about Islam or about the Quran, it's going to be harder.
Right.
So we're trying to equip you to be a missionary to people that are in this worldview. And if you know it well enough, then you can show and you can help lead them out.
That's really helpful. And again, I think that the fact that we do not have to, the advantage of being on the right side of truth and all that kind of stuff is we don't have to be afraid of these questions. We don't have to be afraid of challenges to justice, because if the Bible is the word of God, we can point to that, and we can engage with their conversations, with their arguments quite well with confidence. That's a beautiful thing. Well, one question that kind of connected to the worldview stuff that has come up a couple of times here, and it's come up in the notes that we had prepared, talks about the relationship between critical social theory, critical theories, all this, and Marxism. Now, I know that just a few weeks ago, you had a great conversation with Shane Morris, and you touched on this a little bit. So a couple of the questions that come in here is one what is the connection? Because on the one hand, Marxism is a modernist idea. Marx believes in objective reality after a fashion, but this is much more of a postmodernist idea. So it's not exactly the same. And sometimes as I was listening to your conversation with Shane, what I was thinking about is like, it sounds almost less like Marx as such and more like Lenin and Mao, kind of these guys for whom it is the perpetual revolution, where the revolution becomes the goal. So could you tease out like what the connection is? Is cultural Marxism a fair thing? How's that whole connection in there? If you could expound on that.
Well, you got to buy the book and read it, because we we really have thought about all of these questions. We've gotten these questions from people on Twitter, and I've had emails and answered dozens and hundreds of emails that fielded these questions. So we address these exact issues in the book. Critical social theory today is a cocktail, an elixir that's distilled from a combination of Marxism and postmodernism and feminism and queer theory. It's all mixed together and blended. We highlight the major thinkers from Marx to Horkheimer and Foucault and Crenshaw and Judith Butler. So yeah, it is a mixture. It's not just one thing. It's not one linear course from Hegel to Marx to Crenshaw. It's a river. It's a broad stream that's kind of all intermingling.
Marx, good word, cocktail. I like that.
Cocktail, elixir. Yeah, I'd say that Marx, when you read critical social theorists today, you won't see Marx mentioned that often. And so the term cultural Marxism can be confusing. It is a valid term. People were using it in academia in the 60s and 70s to describe the Frankfurt School. It also has been co-opted by neo-Nazis. They use it too. And so because of that, it has bad connotations. So we don't use that term, but it's a valid scholarly term. I would just be, I do think that the connection to Marxism today is tenuous, because think about how powerful these ideas are within Fortune 500 companies. You have Google, you have Walmart, you have major corporations that have completely capitulated to these woke ideas and yet are making trillions of dollars. Right? So somehow these ideas are coexisting with capitalism at some level. So calling it simply Marxism is not quite right. Something clearly is wrong with that.
I would just mention that historic critical theory, and what Neil reviewed in the beginning of our time here, historic critical theory is both an expansion and an amendment to Marxism. The critical theorists of the Frankfurt School in many ways thought Marx had failed in certain ways. And so historic critical theory is both an amendment and expansion, and an expansion to Marxism. It diverges from Marxism, classical Marxism, in certain ways. And then critical social theory today is an amendment and an expansion of historic critical theory. So there's been more changes and more shifting in the landscape. And it is true that critical social theory today is a strange combination of modernist and postmodernist perspective. On the one hand, critical social theory tells you what you should do, must do, ought to do. It's very modernist in that regard. It makes moral claims that apply to everyone in all eras and across the planet. That's a modernist take. And critical social theory is not embarrassed about that. In fact, and one of my professors used to joke about that dynamic, that really critical social theory is modernist in a lot of ways. And yet we see that postmodern and post-structural emphasis in critical social theory, the notion of deconstructing everything. And that deconstruction project is very paramount in critical social theory. And that is a post-structural and postmodern perspective. So these things are kind of connected together, this hybrid kind of connection that is a little bit odd, but it both things are present at once.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that the deconstructing everything. I remember when I was reading the book Cynical Theories a few years or so back, they were talking about queer theory, and something I never really studied much before. And so much of the whole gamut is queering everything, and it's queering everything in sexuality, clearly in queer theory. But in so much of it is queering. There are no standards. There are no objective thought. It's all undoing. And you think of fashion, it's all about androgyny. There's no objective reality. So I do think there is a worldview aspect and a relationship, and at least an analogy to some of the communist things. Because as some of you said, one of you said earlier, the virtues that you do see in critical social theory, it's similar to, in the same sense that communism, people who have said Marxism is a Christian heresy. Because I mean, in communism, you have prophets from the past, Marx and Lenin and so on, and you have holy books, and you have martyrs, and you even have an eschaton. And the same way you have here with critical social theory, you have holy texts that you're impenetrable sometimes, as I said before, holy texts that you're supposed to imbibe by faith. That there's what is wrong with the world? Well, it's white people. Well, it's all these power structures and stuff like that. What is salvation? Well, it's either recognizing your loss of power and speaking into it, or if you are white, male, etc., if you are on the higher end of the hierarchy, it's a perpetual guilt confession thing. And there's the salvation is kind of a limited salvation because you never really get out of it. It's, again, like I said, that's why I think it fits more with like a Lenin and a Mao, the perpetual revolution. And you and Shane got into that a little bit. There's the perpetual revolution. Well, this has been really high up here, philosophical. I want to bring it down here a little bit because several questions have dealt with either from the ones we had prepared that are on the advertisement for our thing tonight, or some of the questions coming in have to do with concrete things like curricula that you see in schools, that you see in churches. Someone here had mentioned, I'm kind of combined a few questions here to reach as many as I can. Someone mentioned does it build the bridges or be the bridge? I've forgotten the title of it. Various curricula that you see in churches. So kind of the broad question is, what are some ways you've seen specific critical theory, critical social theory show up in the church and schools and things like that as well? And what was your evaluation of some of them, some specific ones?
We have a chapter we reference Latasha Morrison's group and book Be the Bridge and talk about how she invokes notions of corporate ancestral white guilt and need for repentance. And we have a whole chapter devoted to why that's an unbiblical concept. But there are plenty of books like that are out there that are deeply informed by critical social theories. Kristen Dumais' Jesus and John Wayne, Beth Allison Barr's Making of Evangelical Womanhood. There's a ton of books like that are very popular. They're being promoted by evangelicals, or at least certainly being read by them. That are, again, they're not citing critical social theorists, but they're informed by critical social theory. And actually, there's a bit of idea laundering. The idea is like money laundering. You pass money through a chain of legitimate corporations until at the end it looks clean. Idea laundering is the ideas that are rooted in these academic theories that are bad. They get quoted by a Christian author, who gets quoted by another Christian author, gets quoted by another Christian author, and then finally they show up in an evangelical author. So you look at the evangelical author, well, they're only citing Christian books, but if you trace the ideas back and back and back and back, you're like, oh, there's D'Angelo. And so we actually have a number of books like that throughout our book that we cite as examples of how the ideas are finding their way into the church. In curricula, in schools, it's much more obvious. Usually you can see the ideas, the buzzwords. They'll give you a resource list with like Robin DiAngelo, even Rex Kendi on it. You're like, oh, there you go. But in church, it's more subtle, which is, again, why you need to understand the ideas. I know it sounds, it's academic. Give me some practical stuff. The most practical thing you can do is understand the ideas. That's the first section of our book, chapters 2 through 7, is understanding. And that's key to then challenging the ideas. Because otherwise, the problem is if you just firebomb the term CRT, we're going to just get rid of critical race theory. Well, they'll just relabel it anti-racism. We're not doing CRT, we're doing anti-racism. I don't like anti-racism either. Well, we're not doing anti-racism. We're doing critical whiteness pedagogy now. And it's all the same. It's all the same. The authors, the scholars themselves will play that shell game, but we can't. The way to avoid that is to say, forget the label you use. These ideas are false and unbiblical. And that's how you spot them.
Which goes to your Mott and Bailey argument that you mentioned in the book. Do check out the book or Shane's podcast that we did, where they discuss that Mott and Bailey. It's a kind of a slippery way critical theorists will engage with stuff. So, Pat, did you want to add anything in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention kind of an example on the ground that may speak to the question. Certain churches, evangelical churches, are becoming gay affirming. And they're becoming gay affirming because they're saying that the LGBTQIA plus community has been marginalized, disenfranchised, oppressed, and that is not good. And certainly there's some oppression that has been given to that community. You take a teenager, a 14-year-old boy who is gay, and he's bullied at school and he's beaten up because he's gay. Well, that is evil, that is sin, and that is terrible. So there is a sense in which the gay community in certain ways has been oppressed. Well, if a church comes alongside and says, hey, we're gay affirming because the gay community has been oppressed, and Jesus is concerned about the oppressed and the marginalized. Well, in that perspective, some of what is considered to be oppression is not actually oppression. And so when a church becomes gay affirming and then onboards this total holistic notion that the gay community has been oppressed, now we begin to move even further down the line and say, well, okay, how is the gay community been oppressed? Well, one of the ways that they've been oppressed is the reality of heteronormativity and the normalization of heterosexuality and the normative perspective of marriage, which is marriage between one man and one woman. Traditional marriage in this country has been a cultural norm. And so that cultural norm has helped marginalize the gay community, and we need to be against the oppression of the gay community. So now we're going to be gay affirming. But the reality is that traditional marriage between one man and one woman is not an oppression. It is actually righteous and good. And that should be affirmed. And so to make the leap from gay affirming because the gay community has had oppression and been oppressed, and they've been oppressed now because of heteronormative dynamics being present as a cultural norm in society, see, that leap is false. And that's what happens. And people get caught up into just being dizzied by, wow, this group has been oppressed. So we've got to onboard everything that they say relative to how they've been oppressed. And then when you do that and you combine it with the things that I said earlier about a lack of perspicuity around doctrinal integrity and robust theological teaching, now these churches are getting far afield from orthodoxy, and that is being manifested in ways that are very practical, like the issue around gay affirming and what the inroads that think about where a number of evangelical leaders are now relative to the question of people who are gay and connected to the church. We've got to love the gay community without question, but we have got to do that in keeping with God's sexual ethics, or we don't truly and genuinely love the gay community. Now, I've got friends, family, colleagues that are part of the gay community who I love dearly, but we've got to do that relative to sexual ethics. And we can see how the notion of gay affirming is onboarding critical social theory perspective directly into the church.
I just say it starts earlier, actually. It starts with accepting the idea that people of color are oppressed today. Well, when you say that, and that's it's one of the terms we mentioned in our book, the idea that people of color are oppressed today. When you affirm it, seems so commonsensical, and yet when you affirm that statement, what are you saying? Well, are they being cruelly treated on a daily basis? Are they being, tyrannized and beaten? No, of course not. The average person of color, I mean, I'm half Indian. I'm a person of color. I don't walk around fearing for my life. So what do you mean then? Oh, well, I just mean that there are these systems and structures and norms that are making them marginalized and feel othered. Well, once you've redefined the word oppression now, then logically, who else then is oppressed in the same way by having norms that are imposed on them? Well, women. So this patriarchy and toxic masculinity out in the culture, and these norms are oppressing women. Oh, so then you actually have what are some of those norms? Well, like male eldership, male headship in the family. Those are norms. Are they not marginalizing, they're denying agency to women? Oh, I guess we got to be egalitarian now. Well, keep going. Who else is oppressed? Well, gay people, LGBT people are being oppressed because they're these norms again. oh, you appeal to the Bible, but it's your white Western male interpretation of the Bible. So the point is that first step is redefining the word oppression. And it seems so hip and right, but it's wrong. But it's not a slippery slope. It's a logical outworking of a false definition that takes you from race to gender to sexuality to transgender and ultimately to deconstruction.
And I would say I'm 100% with Neil here, absolutely. But we also want to keep in mind that when there is actual racism and oppression and misogyny, that the church has to fight against that. And our book is about a lot of things, including a pathway of racial healing and racial unity. We recognize the evil of racism, not only individually, but in our institutions. And so we go hard after it. So where the oppression is really in play, we as Christians really have to push back against it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's right for us to say that one of the problems with critical theory is it's fundamentally an anti-philosophy. It's against. It doesn't have a constructive thing. It doesn't have an objective thing. It's anti. It's not in the sense that it's not enough to say we're against racism, therefore we're going to bring all this critical stuff on board. At the same time, people who are critical of critical theory, it's not enough to simply be against it. You must be for the right things as well, and you got to bring those things together. Well, I want to do one more question real quick. Could each of you give me one book aside from y'all's? Now, everyone who's listening, you do need to read this book. It's a great book. Do check it out. One book aside from your own that you think is a constructive element, whether it's someone from a critical perspective or someone criticizing them. Other than your own, what is something that someone could go and get some good start on this aside from your own?
I think I am a big fan of primary sources. The one book I'd recommend is a primary source on critical race theory. It's Kiara Bridges' CRT, a primer. It's Kiara Bridges' CRT, a primer. It's 2019. It's very current. She's a law professor at UC Berkeley. She went before like the Senate testimony, a subcommittee testifying about something. But so she's a scholar, a critical race theorist. You can't impugn that source. It's a great, well-written book. It gives you right from the horse's mouth what critical race theory is, what they believe. It's got terms like white privilege, white supremacy, whiteness, heterosexism, all that stuff is in it. So really the best book out there on critical race theory. If you're interested in a primary source, read that one.
Okay, Pat, what is your contribution?
Yes, I would mention that our book gets into a lot of primary sources, so take a look. But if you were going to pick a book that kind of gives you a good snapshot of critical social justice, the book is Everyone Really Equal by Sensoy and D'Angelo. That was a text of mine in one of my Ph.D. classes, among many other texts in that class. And I've taught classes, education classes in my institution where that book has been part of the text in terms of the class that I'm teaching. And that book really lays out this notion of the social binary and then hegemonic power connected to that, the realities of lived experience and the importance of social justice. And there's graphs and charts that are very helpful. And again, it's greatly flawed, but it does give a good primer on critical social theory. And then a good book would be Thaddeus Williams' book that he wrote on social justice. Right. Neil, the name of that book is
It's Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth.
That's right. I always leave out a word when I say that title, and I endorse the book. But and Neil wrote something in the book, but it's a very good book. I appreciate Thad a lot. He did a good job with that book. So those of you who are listening, we would encourage you to get his book as well.
Excellent. Yeah, we have done some things with him before. So I think that thank you so much for being here with us, Drs. Shenvi and Sawyer. Some great information. As you guys can see, but our audience cannot, we have dozens of more questions, many of them very interesting, very helpful. It's not that they're not important, that we don't have time. And I know that in the East Coast, it's getting a little sleepy time for some people. But if for those of you if you have some questions, I may try and collate some of them and deal with some of them on some Breakpoint things. Now, if you're interested in some of the things that we do at Breakpoint, please check us out on our podcast, the Breakpoint podcast. Check out the conversation that our two guests here had with Shane Morris on the Upstream podcast. You can find any of those things at colsoncenter.org. Do check out our our conference is coming up here in May. And again, I believe you two are both going to be there. And I think we're hoping to have a breakout session so we can have some more direct Q&A time with that. I think that'd be a great opportunity for anyone who can come down to Texas. But thank you again to you two. And thank you for anyone else who's been listening and participating.
Thank you.
The culture's really disorienting right now. Things that used to be unthinkable are now in many ways unquestionable. And a lot of us feel dizzy about that, especially those who care deeply about truth. How do we respond? And I want to share truth with how do I do that? What's the connection to what is true? How do I understand this thing that happened, or this story, or this new whatever, to the eternal truths that are grounded in God's story? That sort of clarity is what people say that they find in Breakpoint.
I would say that the average Breakpoint listener is someone like me, someone who lives in this world and is trying to figure out how to do it and how to do it in a godly way. I see people using Breakpoint in their daily lives as almost like a little liturgy, like it's a habit to hear these good words and this encouragement and this discernment. And so it helps you to have sort of a new spiritual habit to encourage you for the day and to challenge you and for you to share with your family and friends.
Being able to have a daily dose of sanity in one way, being able to have a daily grounding in Christian truth that connects God's story that is true with a capital T with the reality on the ground in this cultural moment, they find invaluable.
They want to understand some of these big ideas that are affecting culture and how to engage with them. We want to say, here's maybe a little definition, but this is what the Bible has to say. This is what Christian history has to say. You can influence this culture, and there's hope. You don't have to despair. You don't have to go hide in your house. You can go out there and do something that can help redeem culture.
A win for us is when something that we present helps someone who loves the Lord deal with a point of cultural confusion or cultural crisis. In other words, when what we say actually helps someone think more clearly, have more confidence in the gospel, and have an important conversation with someone that they need to have an important conversation with, and that's a win all the way around. Paul's super clear about in 2 Corinthians 5 is that if you've been reconciled, you're to be a reconciler. So having that clarity of what's happening in the world, confidence that the gospel is the bigger story, that we are part of a kingdom with a king, and that future is secure, then that gives us the ability to approach what's happening in the world, as crazy as it gets, with a whole new posture.